Welcome. Well, thank you for coming to this breakout. And my name is Bill Federer, and we're going to go through history. I do have some copies of my brand new book in the back. It's called Silence Equals Consent, The Sin of Omission, Speak Now or Forever Lose Your Freedom. And Chase, why don't you stand up, Chase? Chase is going to help me at the end. They're $20 each, and so if you want, you can see Chase in the back there. And so who knows what the most common form of government in world history is? Who said monarchy? Right, it's kings. Actually, the default setting for human government is gangs. If we were to get rid of all police, what would we have? We'd have gangs, and you'd have to align with one or the other, and they would demand loyalty. And a gang leader with enough weapons, we call a king, or a pharaoh, or a Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar. And the first attempt to gather people together and rule them as a gang is actually Nimrod, Tower of Babel. And so you have Noah's Ark lands, and then you got the Tigris, Euphrates, Mesopotamia, Fertile Crescent, and the story of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. And that was, in a sense, the first attempt at a one-world government, right? The population of the world was there, and he wanted to control it. Josephus, the Jewish commentator, said Nimrod wanted to build the tower so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. And he made everybody in town bake bricks and bring them, or he would kill them. So defiant against God, oppressive over man. God comes down, confuses the languages, and the people scatter into language groups that turn into nations. Nations were God's invention to postpone a one-world government. But every generation has a king that wants to conquer other nations, and if left unchecked, he'd have been glad to conquer them all, right? And so you have, all the different Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan. They keep getting bigger and bigger. Anybody that can plot on a graph can see that at some point it's going to max out on a global level. And Jesus said wheat and tares grow together till the harvest, right? And so we see that the king, now do you know the first attempt at people ruling themselves without a king? Do you know who that was? The first attempt where you have millions of people and they go for 4 centuries with no king. Around Israelites, right? Around 1400 BC, you have millions of Israelites that come into the promised land, and for 400 years, there's no king. And it's a system that works because every single citizen is taught the law, and they're personally accountable to God to follow the law. And it worked until the priests stopped teaching the law, and every man did what was right in their own eyes. It turns into chaos, right? They get concubines being raped, and they all go to Samuel the prophet, and they say, we want to be like the other countries. We want a king. And the reason this story is important is because the kings of Europe looked to the Bible for their authority, but they looked to the King Saul and on part of the Bible, the divine right of kings. The Calvinist Puritans that founded New England looked to the pre-King Saul part of the Bible. 400 years, millions of people, everybody taught the law, accountable to God to follow it. That's why they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. And so King Saul is the divider between England and America. And why is this important? Because Romans 13, are you familiar with that verse? This is important because I did a thing with George Barnum, who does polling, and it was a 2-hour special on CTN, Christian Television Network, and he brings out the numbers. The areas with the highest percentage of Christians have the lowest voter turnout. It's like, what? And that's because they've been taught that, it's holy not to be involved. And so I address this, that the whole idea of people getting involved in ruling themselves came from the Bible. And so you got these Calvinist Puritans founding New England, and they set up a republic where the citizen is the king. And they look back to this pre-King Saul part of the Bible. And so King Saul's the divider between England and America. The kings of Europe look to the Bible for their authority, but they look to the King Saul and on. The Calvinist Puritans look to the Bible. They look to the pre-King Saul, 400 years, millions of people, no king, everybody accountable to God to follow it. And so Romans 13 says, let everyone be subject to the governing authority, for there's no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. And so Romans 13 is understood differently in a monarchy versus a republic. In a monarchy, subjects submit to the king. In a republic, the citizens are the king. And so all those pastors and churches say, you got to submit to the government. They need to pick up and go to China. When Nebuchadnezzar blows the trumpets, they need to bow to the statue. In America, the citizen is the king. The politicians are our servants. We tell them what to do. Anyway, so the most common form of government is kings. And democracies and republics are attempts to take the power of a king, give it to the people. I talked about ancient Israel, and then in my books I also talk about ancient Rome from about 527 BC up until Julius Caesar. They were a republic with 600 senators, SPQR, Senatus Publicus Romanus. And then I go back to ancient Athens, and they were a democracy. Now, democracy, demos means people, krasi means rule. In a democracy, the people rule. But in a pure democracy, every citizen has to be at every meeting every day to talk about every issue. There's no time for anything else. And if you're not keeping up with what's being talked about today, you are called an idiotus. An idiot. What are we talking about today? Oh, that guy doesn't know what's going on. A republic is where you take care of your family and your farm, and you have someone in your place that goes to the market every day to talk politics. They are your representative. An easy way to remember is the word representative begins with REP, and the word republic begins with REP. Right? So a Republican form of government is where you're the king, you're just ruling through your representatives, whereas in a pure democracy, you're the king, but you personally have to be there. And so the Greek city-states could only grow as large as geographically people could travel there, but the republics could get bigger. So democracies and republics are attempts to take the power of the king, give it to the people. But what if the king wants the power back? Does he just ask for it? Hi, I want to be king. Give me control of your life. Most people aren't in a hurry to give that up. So there's two ways in which the king can take the power back. The first is fear. If you get the entire population into fear, they'll panic and they'll surrender their freedom for security. And the second way is free stuff. The government's so nice, it's giving you free stuff until you get hooked, and then you want some more free stuff, you're going to have to incrementally give up your freedom. It's like a drug dealer takes over a neighborhood two ways. He can come in with guns and get everybody in fear, and they panic and submit to the mob, or the drug dealer's so nice, he's giving away free drugs until you get hooked, then you want some more, you have to sell yourself into prostitution. It's like a hunter catches animals through guns or bait, right? Guns on the front door or baits the back door. And so I was reading How to Catch Pigs in the Wild. Texas, there's a lot of wild pigs. You put a post in the ground and you throw some corn down. The pigs come, ignore the post, eat the corn. Next day, there's 2 posts in the ground. They eat the corn. Next day, 3 posts, 4 posts. You start putting them in a semicircle. And the pigs sort of ignore them, and they're eating the corn. Finally, there's just a little opening. And the pigs squeeze through the opening, they're eating the corn, and you shut the gate, and you caught yourself some wild pigs. And so these tactics are used to get a republic or a democracy to get the people to surrender their freedoms back to a king. And so the first one, fear. How do you get an entire country into fear? Well, you have to sow discord, right? If everything's fine, but if there's an unsettledness, there's fear. And so the first account of somebody sowing discord, imagine being in heaven, and somebody sows discord in heaven. Well, it happened. The devil, right? Do you know the word devil in Greek is diabolos, which means to divide, to sow discord. A third of the angels follow him, they're cast out, and then the devil goes into the garden, and he sows discord. He gets Adam to blame Eve and Cain to kill Abel. And then there's an interesting story of Gideon. So the first 400 years of Israel, no king, the Hebrew Republic. And one story is Gideon. He defeats 100,000 Midianites. And so there's no country even thinking about invading Israel. But Gideon has an illegitimate son named Abimelech. And he goes to the town of Shechem, and he does critical race theory. He does identity politics. He says, is it better for you that the sons of Gideon reign over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. And the men of Shechem said, well, we have to support him because he is our brother. And so he's identifying them on a fleshly level. And then they go to the temple of Baal-berith, the city treasury, and they take money to hire rioters. Antifa, BLM. and they do what? Violence. They gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, wherewith Abimelech hired vain and worthless persons which followed him, and they went into his father's house at Ophir and slew his brethren. And then in this confusion, he usurps power, and they make him king. And so you take a country completely at peace, you got somebody that wants power, they go on the inside, they sow this division, and in the confusion, they seize power. Now, the Hebrew Republic would have ended here rather than a century later with King Saul, had not somebody threw a millstone over the wall and it killed Abimelech. But this concept of sowing division is perfected over the centuries. And 500 years ago, Italy was not Italy. Italy was a bunch of city-states, Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, Siena, and they all had armies and fought. And Machiavelli thought if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he advocates the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is such a good end, because it'll stop the infighting, that any means necessary to get there is justified. Lie, cheat, steal. So if a prince conquers a city and the city does not want to be conquered, they would hate him. But if the prince pays criminals, like Abimelech did, right, to burn barns, smash windows, set things on fire, the people will cry out for help. The prince will come in, get rid of the very criminals that he bribed to create the problems. Nobody will know the better for it, and everyone will praise the prince as a hero. So it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control. You can say that a couple times fast. Create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control. And you know that quote a little more recently with Rahm Emanuel, where he said, you don't ever want a crisis to go to waste. It's an opportunity to do important things you would otherwise avoid. Ben Domenech was interviewed on Fox Primetime years ago. He said, Rahm Emanuel's famous dictum, never let a crisis go to waste, normal times don't produce the outcomes that the authoritarian left wants because people are not scared enough to give them the limitless power they crave. Crises are necessary, and if there aren't any on offer, they manufacture them. And so we see a crisis, our response is how can we help people through it? They see a crisis, their response is how can we usurp power through it? Henry Louis Mencken wrote, the urge to save humanity is almost always a false face for the urge to rule it. So we go through the devil sowing discord in heaven, sowing discord in the garden, sowing discord with Abimelech, Machiavelli taking advantage of discord to siege power. But then the British Empire. It became the biggest empire on planet Earth. The King of England was a globalist, a one-world government guy. The sun never set on the British Empire. He was the George Soros, Klaus Schwab, Larry Fink, BlackRock. He was that of the day. And so how did the British Empire get so big? Did they just walk into a country and say, hi, we want to be the biggest empire in the world? Okay, here are the keys. We're waiting for you. Is that how it happened? Let's look at how the British took over India. In 1714, they opened a trading post that turned into a trading fort that turned into them having guns. And they would go to one of these kingdoms and give them guns, and then go to another kingdom and then give them guns, and then sow discord between the kingdoms. Stir up ancient animosities and rub raw, and when they broke out into fighting and bloodshed, they would weaken each other, and the British would come in to restore order, and they would take control of both kingdoms. And they did this again and again and again until they took over all of India, a quarter of the world's population. They did it in Uganda with 56 different tribes. They would come in and pit one against the other. In Nigeria, they would do this around the world. And they tried doing it in America during the Revolutionary War. The Americans and the Indians had reached an equilibrium, getting along. The British, General Johnny Burgoyne, lands in Canada, comes down and meets with the Mohawk Indians and promises them money for scalps. And so they're coming close to Saratoga, New York, and the Indians ended up scalping Jane McCrae, and so the Americans, the British soldiers get General Burgoyne to tell the Indians to back off, and then the Indians leave, but they kept scalping. And so it's listed as one of the reasons in the Declaration why we rebelled against the King of England. It says this, in the Declaration, the King has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Here we have the British Empire going to these Mohawks, stirring them up for doing this attack. They're doing this critical theory. And the British did it again during the War of 1812. The British controlled Pensacola, Florida. Just north of Pensacola is Fort Mims, Alabama, and the Red Stick Creek Indians. Do you know the French pronunciation of Red Stick? Bâton Rouge. And so the British go to the Red Stick Creek Indians and promise them money for scalps. And so the Red Stick capture Fort Mims, Alabama, and then proceed to scalp all 500 of the captives that they captured. And the historical marker says the Creek Indians had been armed by British at Pensacola in this phase of the War of 1812. Do we really think the British Empire cared about the Red Stick Creek Indians? No, they were coming in. They saw an area of division to sow. And so then you look at Napoleon conquers Europe. The king of Prussia said, we can't get conquered that easy again. We need to strengthen our state. And so he has a philosopher named Hegel, Hegel, who is a professor at the University of Berlin. You know Hegel because he had a student named Karl Marx. Marx was a member of the Young Hegelians, a radical student group. And so Hegel takes what the British were doing, takes what Machiavelli was doing, takes what Abimelech was doing, and turns it into a nice, neat triangle. It's called Hegelian dialectics. And so one corner of the triangle is the thesis, the opposite corner is the antithesis, and the top corner is a synthesis. It sounds complicated, but it's not. So Marx said the thesis is the status quo. It's the way things have been for a long time. Everybody's used to it. You have to create an antithesis. In other words, you have to sow discord. You have to create a problem that is really bad, that gets everybody to panic and fear. And in that panic, they'll surrender their freedoms to somebody that is the antithesis, that has a solution that's just half as bad. And then that becomes the new thesis. And then they create another problem that's really bad. Everybody panics in fear, and they surrender some more of their freedoms to the government to settle for an answer that's just half as bad. That becomes the new thesis. Then they create another problem that's real bad. Everybody panics in fear, surrenders some more of their freedom to the government, and they settle for an answer that's just half bad. And every time they settle, they're giving up a little of their individual freedom to the state. And so, how do you create a problem that's really bad? Karl Marx called it critical theory. You send people into the country to identify all the groups, and then you pit them against each other, and you send in agitators, agent provocateurs, community organizers, labor organizers. Their job is to find people with grievances, and you stir them up to riot, and then when the whole country gets into a panic, they surrender their freedoms to somebody that promises to restore order, but you have half the freedoms you had prior to that. And so the idea was you would look at the economic groups. Originally, it was the proletariat versus the bourgeois, which is the working class against the business owners, the rich against the poor, and then, or the poor against the rich. Then it was the blacks against the whites, and the Catholics against the Protestants, and the Muslims against the Christians. It didn't matter. The economic differences, the Sunni, Shia, Orthodox, the Serbs, the Croatians, the Bosnians, didn't matter. They would just study and see which ones can be classified as victims and which ones can be oppressors, the haves and the have-nots. And then they would stir them up against each other to commit this riot. And then in the confusion, they would seize power. The colonizing countries were perfected this. In the Congo and in Rwanda, the people saw themselves as one for centuries. But the Belgian and German colonizers came in and measured them and their features, and they said, you're a Hutu and you're a Tutsi. And they made them go down to the government offices and register as a Hutu and a Tutsi. And then they stirred up animosity between them, and they genocided each other. And in the confusion, the colonizing power could seize control of the country. And so so that's why when you hear Patrisse Cullors, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, say we are trained Marxists, we're facing people that are trained on how to get a country to fight itself. Castro said in Cuba, the revolution needs the enemy. The revolutionary needs his antithesis, which is the counter-revolutionary. And if enemies were lacking, they had to be fabricated. In other words, you can't get people just to give up their freedoms. You need a crisis. You need something that gets them to fear. You need something that I'm going to save you from it. And if there isn't any enemy, you got to fabricate an enemy. Like a white supremacist or a Christian nationalist, or you create something that really doesn't exist because you want to get people into fear so that we're going to save you from them, right? And so Jesus warned of this. Mark 3, if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. Lincoln gave a speech, a house divided against itself cannot stand. It's like introducing an autoimmune disease into the body politic. What's an autoimmune disease? It's where your own immune system starts attacking your own organs and your own joints. You got inflammation. You got a war going on inside of your own body. And so this is taking the body politic, and you go in there and you break people into subgroups and you get them into war with each other. It weakens the body so they can conquer it. So how do you destroy a marriage? Sow division. How do you destroy a family? Sow division. How do you destroy a church? Sow division. How do you destroy a country? Sow division. And so during the Cold War, these were called color revolutions. So after World War II, you had countries in Europe become republics and elect leaders. And the Soviets did not like that, so they send in their KGB agents to do critical theory. And they would observe all these different groups, and they would pit them against each other, and they would stir them up to protest and riot, and then they would co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame the new leader of the new country for all the problems. And when the leader's popularity fell because everybody was blaming him for the problems, then they would do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. And country after country was falling, and Truman did nothing because he thought the United Nations that he helped form would bring world peace. But the next president is Eisenhower, and he can do something or nothing, right? These countries another one falls into the Soviet orbit. And so he decides when Iran has a leader named Mossadegh, and in the early 1950s, he's beginning to side with the Soviet Union. And so the head of the CIA is Allen Dulles. His brother, John Foster Dulles, the airport in Virginia is named after him. So Allen Dulles sends over Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. It's called Operation Ajax. And he's an expert in foreign languages. He goes to Tehran, and he does the same thing in reverse. He recruits mobsters and gangsters and radical imams, and he stages protests and riots and smashing things and co-opts the media to blame Mossadegh for all the problems. And when Mossadegh's popularity fell, they put him under house arrest, locked him away for the rest of his life where he dies, and they replaced him with the Shah, who loved America. And so these tactics went on for 50 years, being perfected by both sides. Allen Dulles did the same thing in Guatemala, and the CIA did it in the Congo, Dominican Republic, South Vietnam, Brazil, Chile, and elsewhere, and the KGB did it. The KGB started the PLO with Yasser Arafat to do what? To sow division in the Middle East, right? The Palestinian Liberation Army. Whenever you see Liberation Army, that's Soviet. And so you have the ELN in Bolivia, with Che Guevara, and you have FARC in Colombia. All these groups, their whole goal is to sow division in a country. Castro in Cuba, and he meets with, the Brezhnev. And so Franklin Roosevelt gave an interesting quote in November 1st, 1940. He said, "Whoever seeks to set one nationality against another seeks to degrade all nationalities. Whoever seeks to set one race against another seeks to enslave all races." And then Franklin Roosevelt said, January 2nd, 42, "Remember the Nazi technique. Pit race against race, religion against religion, prejudice against prejudice, divide and conquer." And NBA player Charles Barkley on the CBS Sports panel, April 3rd, 2021, when they were having riots, Charles Barkley said, "Man, I think most white people and black people are great people. I really believe that in my heart. But I think our system is set up where our politicians, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, are designed to make us not like each other so they can keep their grasp of money and power. They divide and conquer. We're so stupid following our politicians. Now, thank God for the good ones. We need to back them. We need to fill our offices with them," right? But this is his quote. He says, "Their only job is, hey, let's make the whites and blacks not like each other. Let's make the rich people and the poor people not like each other. Let's scramble the middle class. I truly believe that in my heart." Even Malcolm X, and he gave a quote, and I have it in my book, where he says, "The white conservative and the white liberal both want power, but the white liberal has perfected the art of pretending to be the black man's friend. But in the political football game, that we're just a ball," and he says, "right now, the white liberal controls the ball." And so he says they're coming into our community and they're pretending like they're our friends, but they're just wanting to use us. And so these tactics of sowing division come down to Saul Alinsky. Now, who was Saul Alinsky? He rules for radicals. He rode around with Al Capone's hitmen in Chicago, Frank Nitti. And so all they had to do, right? They had the Al Capone's Italian gang versus the Irish gang, right? And so all Frank Nitti did was go into a neighborhood, kill a few people, smash a few windows. The whole neighborhood gets panicky in fear, and they surrender their freedom to the mob in exchange for being left alive. And so Saul Alinsky says, hey, let's take these mob tactics and put them into politics. And so in his book, Rules for Radicals, by the way, Hillary Clinton did her senior thesis at Wellesley College on Saul Alinsky. And a previous president was an Alinsky organizer in Chicago. And Alinsky said this: the first step in community organization is community disorganization. Disruption of the present organization is the first step. The organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent, fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. The organizer polarizes the issue and helps lead his forces into conflict. He must search out controversy, for unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. And did you know, in the front of Saul Alinsky's book, he has an acknowledgement to Lucifer. It's right there, right? And so we started off talking about the devil sowing discord in heaven. And so this is Alinsky's quote: lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. By the way, Rolling Stone magazine interviewed Saul Alinsky 2 months before his death in June of 1972. And Alinsky said this: if there is an afterlife and I have anything to say about it, I will unreservedly choose to go to hell. Hell would be heaven for me. Once I get into hell, I'll start organizing the have-nots over there. They're my kind of people. It's like, I don't think that's what hell is. So, the entire last 50 years, you and I have been subjected to this type of political strategy, breaking the country into groups. This division even is in education. They'll teach the kids new math, and so they'll come home to the parents, and the parents can't figure it out. And so these kids will think, okay, my parents are dumb, my teacher's smart. Right? They'll come in, they'll try to sow division between husband and wife, and sow division between male and female. I mean, the whole thing is breaking it into division. James Lindsay is expert in explaining this because for the longest time, it was the proletariat versus the bourgeois, the working class versus the business owners. But in America, we didn't have centuries of ruling class. So they said, okay, we can't do that. We have to find other things that we can make divisions: race, religion, and sex. Now, it's one thing, them creating the crisis to get you to panic and give up your freedoms. But they want to blame you for the crises. So it's something called psychological projection, blame shifting, where the attacker blames the victim. You accuse others of what you do. It's in the Bible. Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of lusting after her when she was lusting after him. The cheating spouse will accuse the faithful spouse of being unfaithful. Little kids know how to do it. I didn't start the fight, you did, right? In psychology, it's called a narcissistic defense mechanism to avoid responsibility. When somebody's caught doing something wrong, they instinctively want to blame the person that caught them. And so another part in the Bible, the Apostle Paul is in the temple in Jerusalem praying, and some Pharisees see him, and they stir up a riot, and they're pulling Paul apart, and the Romans come and rescue Paul, and he's had a trial, and it says, Tertullus began to accuse Paul, saying, we found this man a pestilent fellow, a mover of sedition, blah, blah, blah. And Paul says, they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up a tumult. They blamed Paul for stirring up the insurrection at the Capitol, when they're the ones that did it. And Nero set fire to Rome and blamed the Christians. And so, David Axelrod, was an advisor to President Obama. And on NPR radio, April 19th, 2010, he said, in Chicago, there was an old tradition of throwing a brick through your own campaign office window and then calling a press conference to say you've been attacked. So you do the bad stuff and you blame and they have to back up and say, no, I didn't. And their name gets smeared with it in the media. The crime, the person's name. The crime, the person's name. And when it finally gets pointed back at the guilty person, by that time the water's muddied. The public doesn't know who to trust and they get a pass. And so when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she approved transfer of a fifth of the U.S. uranium to Russia. At the same time, there's sort of coincidentally $145 million from Russians deposited into her Clinton Foundation. And evidence is, even the New York Times said, cash flowed to Clinton Foundation amid Russian uranium deal. So it looks like she's colluding with Russia. So what does she do? She pays for a Steele dossier to accuse her opponent of colluding with Russia. And then the investigation process is simply an excuse for her Department of Justice to subpoena all the information that could convict her and destroy it. You know, servers in her basement and hard drives and cell phones and emails, delete. And if it ever gets pushed back and pointed back at her, all she had to do was pay a $113,000 fine to the FEC for paying for the Steele dossier that started this whole thing off. And then let's say there's another candidate running for president, and he is on C-SPAN, and he's admitting to extorting Ukraine. I told them, unless they stop investigating my son, I'm going to hold back billions of dollars of U.S. aid. Clearly extorting Ukraine. What do? They accuse his opponent of the exact thing, of extorting Ukraine. And so they knew that Biden had classified documents in his garage. And they knew it was going to go public. And so they staged a very visible attack at Mar-a-Lago for one reason only, headlines. They wanted to cement it in the public's mind, Trump classified documents, Trump classified. And when it finally comes out that Biden had classified documents, Pence had classified documents, by that time it's old news. The water's muddied and they get a pass. And so this tactic is used over and over again. Charlie Hurt of Fox News said on Hannity, May 23rd, 2019, Charlie Hurt said, this whole thing is like this game of projection. Whenever they accuse President Trump of doing, we find out not only did President Trump not do it, but they did it. And they do it to you every day in the news. Right? Those conservatives are hateful when they're hateful. And they're intolerant when they're intolerant. They're sowing division when they're sowing division. They're wanting to steal the election. You stole the election. Right? And anyway, even some students met with Saul Alinsky. And this is in his book, Let Them Call Me Rebel. It says this, in 1972, students asked Alinsky to help plan a protest of a scheduled speech by George H.W. Bush, then U.S. Representative to the UN. He told them to go dressed as members of the Ku Klux Klan. And whenever Bush said something in defense of the Vietnam War, they should cheer and wave placards reading, the KKK supports Bush. And that is what the students did with very successful results. So in other words, you go to your opponent's rally dressed as faux supporters, but your whole job is to sow division. And so this concept is developed with what's called false flags. So not only do they sow the division to seize power, they want to blame you for it, but it ratchets up. So what's a false flag? I spoke in Beaufort, North Carolina. It's on the Outer Banks. It was a big Republican event. They had judges and congressmen. And right out the windows is the waves. I mean, it was right there. And the person that drove me around ran the museum for Blackbeard, because that's where he sunk his Queen Anne Revenge pirate ship. And he said, pirates really didn't want to get into a battle because if they got wounded, there were no pirate hospitals to go to. And so it was all psychological. He says they would sit in their boat waiting for a friendly ship to pass by, and they would raise a flag that would signal friendly ship in distress. And the ship would come by, look at their tail, oh, look, there's a friendly ship in distress. And they would get closer and closer and closer until they got too close to get away. And down would come the friendly nation in distress, and up would come the pirate flag. And the people would say, oh no, and they tried to sail away, but their ship was slow, and the pirates were fast. And Blackbeard was like 6'8", big moppy black hair with a beard, and he would take the wicks that you would light the cannons with, and he'd light them on fire and stick them in his beard and his hair, so it looked like this big smoking demon. He'd have a knife in his teeth, he'd have his pistols, and his pirates would jump onto the ship, and the people would say, okay, just take my money, let me live, right? It was a psychological operation that went into our vernacular. A false flag is a event created to get people into fear and panic so they'll quickly surrender their freedoms. And so some stories. The King of Sweden in 1788 wanted his parliament to approve war with Russia, but the parliament would not. And so the King of Sweden had the tailor of the Royal Swedish Opera sew Russian uniforms and had the Swedish soldiers put on the Russian uniforms and stage an attack at a Swedish outpost at Pumala. And the word spread all the way across Sweden to Stockholm. The Russians had attacked. And the parliament says, okay, and they approved the funding. The Nazis did this. It's called the Gleiwitz incident. 1939, the Nazis wanted to invade Poland. And the world public opinion would have said the Nazis were the aggressors. And so the Nazis had soldiers dress up in Polish uniforms and stage an attack at a German outpost at Gleiwitz that happened to have a radio tower. And they're giving play-by-play announcements. The Polish are coming in, the Polish are shooting, the Polish, and it goes across Germany and the world. The Polish had attacked, and the Germans said, well, you started it, and they invade and they take control of Poland and start World War II. The Russians did it. They wanted to invade Finland, and they had the Soviets shelled one of their own Russian villages, but made it look like the Finns did it, so they could invade Finland in 1939 in the Winter War. The Japanese did it. 1931, the Japanese were able to get a railroad along the edge of China, and they claimed that there was a railroad explosion at Mukden, and they said, well, the Chinese blew up our Japanese railroad, we're going to invade. And they killed 100,000 in Nanking, China. And later they did an international investigation, walked the whole railroad. There was no explosion. They made it all up. And then the Turks did it. 1950, so they had Ataturk was a secular leader, and he wanted to make Turkey more Western and progressive. But then in 1955, they get a leader named Menderes. And he wants to go back to this Ottoman Sultan caliphate, and he's bothered by some Greek Christians in Constantinople. And so Menderes arranges for a Turkish university student to plant some bombs in Ataturk's birthplace over in Greece and the Turkish consulate in Greece. The bombs never went off, but the newspapers ran with the headlines anyway. Bombs blow it up. It stirs Istanbul into a frenzy. They attack the Greek neighborhood, smash the windows, tear down churches, and drive out the Greek remnant. And so this tactic was also used recently in Turkey when Erdogan, in the growing anti-Erdogan movement, he stages a coup against himself. Remember that? Gets in an airplane, flies in a circle, lands, and claims that there was this coup attempt. And he uses it as an excuse to arrest all of his political opponents so he could stay in power. And Stalin did it. There was an anti-Stalinist movement in 1934. And he, at the same time, had a supporter named Sergei Kirov, the party boss of Leningrad. And so Stalin had an idea. He would assassinate his supporter, Sergei Kirov, and eliminate a potential rival, and blame the assassination on the anti-Stalinists. Nobody would suspect that he did it because he and Sergei Kirov were friends, and everybody would believe the anti-Stalinists did it because they didn't like Stalin, they didn't like Sergei supporting Stalin. Stalin used this as an excuse to have some hearings, to do some investigations, to detain people, arrest people, and to kill over 1 million people in the First Great Purge in 1936. Germany did it. It was a republic in the 1920s, the Weimar Republic. There was a political party called the National Socialist Workers' Party, or Nazi, and the head of it was Hitler. And it had an under-the-table violent arm to it, sort of like Abimelech hired those vain and worthless persons, Machiavelli, right, getting people. And so Hitler's under-the-table people were called brown shirts. They were nicknamed Sturmabteilung, which means stormtroopers, because they would storm into the meetings of Hitler's opponents and disrupt the meeting. And then they would lock arms and block streets. Could you imagine people holding hands and blocking streets? And then they smashed windows. They went into the cities and they smashed over 7,500 stores owned by Jews, called the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht. Just burning the cities. Oh, and then did I mention their capital got set on fire? The burning of the Reichstag. And evidence points to Hitler's own people doing it, but in the confusion, Hitler decides he's going to have some hearings. He's going to have some investigations. He's going to detain people, and he shot all of his opponents without a trial. And when the dust settled, Hitler didn't have any opponents left. And so when the first people broke into the U.S. Capitol, I have a little video here that I can't show you because I don't have a screen, but I can play the audio for you. And
I want you to pay attention to the first group of assailants as they break into the building. The second man through the window is wearing full tactical body armor and is carrying a baseball bat.
In other words, they didn't look like they were people that went to hear President Trump's speech and they suddenly got a little riled up and they decided to go into the... I mean, you don't show up with full tactical gear, right? And they're all dressed in black. And then it comes out that there's FBI people in the crowd. And like lots of them. And Ray Epps, who's on video saying, let's break into the Capitol. And he's texting, I'm orchestrating this whole thing. And so it looked like it was one of these things that was done by all these other people throughout history. You create a crisis, and then you blame it on your political opponents as an excuse to get rid of them. You know, I was listening to a quote by Peter Thiel, founder of PayPal. He's at Stanford Classical Liberalism Lecture, November 18th, 2022. Peter Thiel said this: the zeitgeist, or the mood on the other side, is we are not going to make it for another century on this planet, therefore we need to embrace a one-world totalitarian state right now. He goes on, whatever the dangers are in the future, we need never underestimate the danger of a one-world totalitarian state. He goes on, 1 Thessalonians 5:3, the political slogan of the Antichrist is peace and safety. And he ends, I want to suggest we would do well to be a little more scared of the Antichrist and a little less scared of Armageddon. In other words, don't be afraid of the world ending. Be afraid of the people that promise to save you from the world ending. And so these tactics, the Muslims use them, right? So you got the peaceful Muslims, but then you got the Muslim Brotherhood, started in 1928. And their idea was you infiltrate countries pretending like you're peaceful, and then when you get a signal, you assassinate. And so that's how they tried to assassinate Ataturk in Turkey. They did assassinate Abdullah, king of Jordan. And Anwar Sadat makes peace with the Jews, right, in 1973. And they both get the Nobel Peace Prize. And Anwar Sadat is having a parade. The soldiers go by, and they stop, and they turn with their guns, and they assassinate the leader of Egypt. And so this idea of you infiltrate countries, then you overthrow them. Now, I'll end with this one thought. Here we are. We're facing crises. I truly believe that out of all the recorded history, the good Lord decided for you to be alive right now. And no coach saves his worst player till the end. He saves his best player, right? I mean, if you want to send your best batter in to bat cleanup, your fastest runner to run the last leg of the relay, right? I think that God chose for you to be alive right now. Instead of, oh, it looks really bad. It's like, no, this is your turn. You know, someday you'll be dead and you'll be in heaven. All right, I'm a Christian. I believe you'll be in heaven because Jesus died on the cross to pay for your sins. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise than when we just begun, imagine you've been in heaven for 10,000 years. And you meet Moses. Maybe you're walking the streets of gold. You meet Moses. I don't know what it's like up there, but Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many mansions. So I bet Moses will have a pretty nice place. He'll probably have one of those... He'll probably have one of those big fireplaces where the logs don't burn up. Get it? The burning bush in the wilderness didn't burn up in the logs in his fireplace. I heard one preacher say, in heaven, you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. My wife will say, where were you? I was thinking about something else. But imagine we all get there, and and maybe he's got a big living room like this size. And after the small talk's over, you say, Moses, tell us the story. I read the book, I even saw the movie. But here you are in person. So the room gets quiet. Moses stands up, and he says, it looked really bad. The government of Pharaoh was charging in at us with chariots and swords, and we were totally unarmed. And I just stood there with my staff. I said, God, use me to deliver your people. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. Then we're going to look around the room and see David. Say, David, tell us your story. Room gets quiet. He stands up. He says, I was just a teenager. And this thug Goliath was mocking our God, and these grown-ups were too chicken to do anything. I said, enough of that. Took my little sling, went out there, hit him in the head, took his own sword and chopped his head off. And one by one, we're going to hear the stories. Esther, whether I die, I die. I'm going to go in and approach the king. And Gideon and Apostle Paul. And then everyone in the room is going to look at you. Say, you, we haven't heard your story yet. Tell us, what was going on down on earth when it was your turn to be down there? What were they saying about God in your country, or the baby that the Lord knew in the mother's womb, or sex that God created them in the beginning, male and female? What did you do when the government it looked hopeless? You know, I'd hate for any of us to be up there and Jesus walk in the room and have a big screen come down and him show all kinds of great things happening and him say, this is what I had planned for you to do down on earth, but you just didn't have enough faith and courage. And you look back at your life and that mountain that held you back was a little anthill, a little fear of man. What are people going to say about me? I mean, think of it. The Apostle Paul getting shipwrecked and beaten, and you're like, oh, they might post something bad about me on the internet, you know? But you're in heaven, right? Because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for your sins, so you don't have a chance to go back to earth and do anything else. But guess what? You're still on this earth. You still have breath in your lungs. You still have feet that trod the soil. You still have a chance to do those great things that you will be known for forever. God chose for you to be alive right now. This is your chance. Be bold, be strong, and go forth in the glory of God.